This is Ben May, and I want to thank you for being with us as we continue to seek the old paths. This time we are marking the beginning of a brand new study guide, a brand new part of the Bible that we will be looking at now for the next 13 weeks, Lord willing. Our plan is sort of ambitious. We have, again, as I said, a new study guide that is put out by Bob and Sandra Waldron. It's called You Shall Be My People. We'll cover Exodus and Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and then the first 5 chapters of Joshua. Now, this is going to cover some very important time in the history of God's people. And what I have tried to do, and I'll continue to try to do this time, is to point out things as we study in the Old Testament that are important to know as you study the New Testament. Remember what we read in Romans chapter 15 and verse 4. For whatsoever things were written aforetime were written for our learning, that we, through the patience and comfort of the Scriptures, might have hope. And that's what we want to do. We want to deepen our understanding of the New Testament by better understanding the Old. There is so important. So much of the New Testament is really composed of various quotes taken directly from the Old Testament, and it really helps us to understand the context of those quotes. And so we have just finished the study of Genesis. Remember that we divided the Bible into 17 distinct Bible periods, and we have the first 4 of those covered as we look at Genesis. There was before the flood, the scattering of the people, and the patriarchs. Now, most of the book of Genesis dealt with the patriarchs from about chapter 12 all the way through chapter 50. But we talked about the creation before the flood. And we talked about how wicked man had become, and God decided to destroy man with a flood, except for Noah and his family. We talked about how that man did not want to scatter over the whole earth, so God scattered them by confusing their language, the scattering of the people. And then we talked about how God dealt with the heads of families. Father rule is what patriarch means. And we primarily have looked at Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and the 12 sons of Jacob, especially the last several chapters of Genesis dealing with Joseph, and how that God's providence was with Joseph, even when his brothers who were angry with him and jealous of him sold him into slavery. And he ends up through, again, God's providence, rising to power to be second in command of all the land of Egypt during a terrible famine. And then he ends up bringing his family, Jacob, his other brothers, and all of their belongings from the land of Canaan, where they were sojourning. They were pilgrims there. They did not own land there except for a small strip. And now he brings them to Egypt really to save their lives. In fact, he tells his brothers who did him wrong, but he says, now look, God meant this for good, to preserve life. So don't be angry with yourselves. And neither was he angry with his brothers. And so we end the book of Genesis at the death of Joseph, but also with Joseph saying, I want you to bring my bones away from Egypt back to the land that God's going to give you. God will surely visit you. And we talked about how that word visit meant to come to the rescue of. And so the political climate seemed to have been changing even at the time of Joseph's death, though not nearly as bad as it would become. And so that's how the book of Genesis now closed its doors, you might say. And now we come to Exodus chapter 1, and we start our new study. Now, in Exodus 1 and in verse 8, it says, Now there arose a new king over Egypt who did not know Joseph. And he said to his people, Look, the people of the children of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal shrewdly with them, lest they multiply. And it happened in the event of war that they also join our enemies and fight against us, and so go up out of the land. Therefore they set taskmasters over them to afflict them with their burdens. And so Pharaoh, while he on one hand was afraid of this mighty people, these people had started out with 70, and now they are a mighty people. He's afraid of them, and yet he says, we could lose them. They could side with our enemies and end up leaving the land, and so he didn't want to lose them either. And so he decides to make their burdens harder and heavier and put them under taskmasters. And so that's their lot in life as it has come to be. Now, Moses now, as the story is going to unfold, is going to come along in chapter 2. And we want to look in this first lesson at sort of that beginning of Moses being called to a great position of leadership. Now, here's a chart of the genealogy, just a sampling of the genealogy, similar to what we've looked at in the last study, but much more abbreviated. Here's Abraham, his son Isaac, his son Jacob. Now, Jacob, remember, had 12 sons, but let's list Levi, Judah, and Joseph. Now, Levi has 3 sons named Gershon, Kohath, and Merari. Kohath has 2 sons named Amram and Izhar. Amram, he has 2 sons named Moses and Aaron. And then Izhar has a son named Korah. Now, all these names, especially these last 3, Moses, Aaron, and Korah, are going to be important. Korah for a brief time, but Moses and Aaron throughout really all of our study. And so you see now, notice who they are descendants of. Levi, that's going to be important as our study unfolds. Speaking of our study now, if you have your work guide, you have an index in the very front of it that'll give you a schedule that we're going to do our best to keep. Lord willing, we'll cover our study in about 13 weeks. And so I encourage you to read some every day. And we'll hit the highlights during our time together and study in detail at home as we can. And so I encourage you to do that. And order your study guide if you have not already done so. They're completely free of charge, and we'll get that right out to you. Now here's a map that shows the route that they are going to take from Egypt to the Promised Land, because that's really what we are covering in our study, from their captivity in Egypt as slaves all the way until they are ready to enter the Promised Land. But notice on the map, now, do you see where Egypt is? There's the Nile River. It just branches out. And toward the right of that branch that kind of forks out is the land of Goshen. That's where the children of Israel were, remember? And then they're going to leave that land, and they're going to head to the Promised Land, to Canaan. Now, do you spot Canaan now on your map? Now, Canaan looks like it would be the simplest way is to go right along the edge of the Mediterranean Sea and right over into Canaan. But notice the red line. Notice that they don't go that way. They go south. They go to Sinai, the Sinai Peninsula. And they're going to go to Mount Sinai and spend a lot of time there. And then they'll turn and travel north and to head up that way by the Gulf of Aqaba to go to the Promised Land. Now, there are reasons for that, and we'll cover that as we go through our study. But that gives you a very broad overview. Now, again, an interesting thing is that it's going to take them 40 years to go from Egypt to Canaan. But remember in our last study, when Jacob, Joseph's father, died, he made Joseph promise him to bury him in the land of Canaan. Only took a few days. They go, they bury Jacob in the land of Canaan, come back to Egypt. And now it's going to take them 40 years. Well, again, there are reasons for that. And we'll see that as we continue our study. Now, we find, remember, again, that Pharaoh was very much afraid of the children of Israel. He made their lives hard in verse 14 of chapter 1. Then in verse 15, he gets another bright idea, as leaders sometimes think they have. He says to the midwives, of the Hebrew midwives, he said in verse 16, now here's what I want you to do. If you go and you're helping deliver a baby, if it's a boy baby, I want you to kill it. And if it's a girl, I want you to let it live. Wow, they didn't do it. They feared God. They weren't about to do that. And so they gave the excuse to Pharaoh that, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. Why, they have their babies before we even get there. And so that didn't work, so Pharaoh issued another decree. And he decided now in verse 22, every son who is born you shall cast into the river, and every daughter you shall save alive. So he took it out of the hands of the midwives and he put the burden back onto the people themselves, telling them to kill their own child. What a hard thing, and yet those were the commands of Pharaoh. Can you imagine the consequences if they didn't obey? Well, then in chapter 2, we find that there was a man of the house of Levi, and he went and took as wife a daughter of Levi. And so we find this man and woman, their names are given elsewhere as Amram, a Hebrew, and Jochebed, both Levites, and they have a son. And they see this child, and it was evidently a very beautiful child, and it says so in verse 2 of chapter 2. And so they hide him for 3 months, and then they just couldn't hide him any longer. And they decided to put him in a little basket and put him in the river, and they set his sister Miriam as a watch to see what would happen to the child. And so Miriam is watching. And then lo and behold, Pharaoh's daughter comes along to bathe in the river. And she hears the baby crying, and she sends her maid to go out and see what this is in this basket. And they open up the basket, and here's this beautiful Hebrew male child. Can't help but believe Pharaoh's daughter knew the orders, but she had compassion on the child. Well, Miriam, remember, is watching this, the sister. And so she approached the princess. And in chapter 2 and verse 7, then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you? And Pharaoh's daughter said to her, go. So the maiden went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages. Isn't that wonderful? The mother ends up getting her child back, and not only getting her child back to raise, getting paid for it. And so Jochebed cares for her son until he is weaned. Difficult to say exactly how old that is, 2, 3, 4 years old. And so the princess now takes him as her son, and she names him Moses. The name Moses means drawn out. She drew him out of the water. And so Moses was a very appropriate name. Well, now we're not told anything now about this from the time that the child is weaned until verse 11 of chapter 2. It just says that it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown. Well, we find out as we continue reading that about 40 years has gone by. And Moses sees an Egyptian beating a Hebrew. And he doesn't like this at all. Remember, a Hebrew raised him, his own mother. I don't know how much interaction they had. It sounds like a fair amount, but we don't know after he's weaned if she gets to see him all along. But he knows who he is. He knows he's a Hebrew. And he doesn't like this Egyptian beating one of his brethren. And so he killed the Egyptian. He looks around, to see if anybody's watching. He buries him in the sand. And then later he sees 2 Hebrew people quarreling amongst themselves. And he steps in, and one of them says, are you going to kill me like you did the Egyptian? And so he knows that it's known. Perhaps the Hebrew that he rescued, maybe he told it. And so Moses knows he's got to flee. In fact, Pharaoh finds out, and Pharaoh is seeking to kill Moses. Now remember, Moses would have been raised as Pharaoh's grandson. Moses flees, and he ends up in the land of Midian. Now, in Midian, we find that he comes to Midian in chapter 2 and verse 15. He sits down by a well. And the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came out to draw water, and they filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And then some shepherds come up, and they're being mean to them, it sounds like, and they drive them away. But Moses stands up and helps them, and he waters their flock. He befriends these 7 daughters. And so they come back to Reuel, their father, and he wonders, how did you get home so quickly? And they tell him the story of what had happened. And so Reuel, also known as Jethro, invites Moses to come and to stay with them. And he does this. And so he is given one of the daughters of Jethro as a wife, named Zipporah. They have a son named Gershom, and later they have another son. Again, Zipporah was the daughter of the priest of Midian. Now, we don't know a lot about their religion, if they had faith in God or not, though Jethro does come to have faith in God. And so Moses seems to be pretty content. Time goes by. The king of Egypt that was seeking the life of Moses, he dies. And the Bible says that God hears the cries of Israel and remembered his covenant. As we look down in verse 24 of chapter 2, he remembered his covenant with Abraham, with Isaac, and with Jacob. He looked upon the children of Israel, and God acknowledged them. Not that he had ever forgotten them, but now they're brought to the forefront of activity, you might say. And it's time now for God to start carrying out his promises to Abraham. As of now, none of those promises, those 3 promises, remember from our study, he made to Abraham, repeated to Isaac, repeated to Jacob. I'm going to make you a great nation. I'm going to give you this land, and through thee and thy seed all the nations of the earth will be blessed. None of them have come to pass, but they're going to as we continue in our study. Now, Moses is out doing what he has been doing for some 40 years. He takes his flock, Jethro's flock, to Mount Sinai, probably some fair distance away from, you might say, their home camp. They were very nomadic as they would follow the grazing land with their flocks. Moses is looking, he's on the mountain, Mount Sinai, and he sees this bush, and this bush is burning. Well, that would catch your attention, but what really caught his attention, the bush wasn't burning up. And so here we have the very famous story of Moses and the burning bush. And so he turns aside to see this strange sight, and then an angel speaks to him, representing the Lord, from the midst of this burning bush. In fact, tells him to take off his shoes from his feet, because the ground where he is standing is holy ground. Because, again, God is there, represented again by the angel. And the Lord now is going to speak to Moses. Can you just imagine? Going about your normal daily routine, been doing it for 40 years, and all of a sudden, God speaks to you. And chapter 3 and verse 7, it says, I've come down to deliver them out of the hand of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and large land, to a land flowing with milk and honey. Now therefore, behold, the cry of the children of Israel has come to me. Come now therefore, and I will send you to Pharaoh, that you may bring my people, the children of Israel, out of Egypt. Now can you just imagine being given this task? I want you to go back to Pharaoh, the king of the most powerful nation probably of his day, and I want you to tell them to let my people go. And Moses, he just is not up for this at all. In fact, he just does not want to go. And so now Moses is going to start offering just one excuse after another. He says in verse 11 of chapter 3, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should bring the children of Israel out of Egypt? Who am I? Now remember earlier, as a younger man, Moses had stepped in and killed an Egyptian for beating a Hebrew, and stepped in between 2 Hebrews to try to help them, thinking that he was going to be more than he was ready to be. He was going to be some kind of deliverer even way back then, but it was not to be, and he put that far out of his mind. That was the last thing he wanted to do. So who am I, Lord, that I should go to Pharaoh? And God assures him that I'll be with you. And this will be a sign for you that when you brought the people out of Egypt, you're going to come right back here where we are to worship. And sure enough, that's going to happen. But Moses is not through arguing with God. He's thinking through this. He's thinking, now just imagine, I'm going back to my people that I have not seen in 40 years. And I'm going to say, God has appeared to me, and you know what? I'm going to lead you out of here. And we're out of here, and we're going back to the land of Canaan, to a land flowing with milk and honey. And they're going to say, well, for one thing, when I say God has appeared to me, they will say, what is his name? Who is this? How did he identify himself to you? And God tells him, well, you say that I am who I am in verse 14. You say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. a grand statement of divinity. But then he says, now suppose they say, well, the Lord has not appeared to you. And really, if you think about it, that's a pretty legitimate concern. Why should they believe me that the Lord has appeared? And they'll say, why no, the Lord has not appeared to you. And so we get down now to chapter 4. And the Lord says to Moses, what is that in your hand? He had a rod. And he tells him to throw the rod down, and he does, and it becomes a snake. And Moses rightly flees from it. He says, now pick the snake up. And he reached down, picked it up by the tail. It becomes a rod again. And then he says, now here's what else I want you to do. In verse 6, now therefore it says, now you put your hand in your bosom. And he put his hand. He said, now take it out. And it was leprous. Now put your hand back. And he put his hand back into his bosom. Take it back out. And it's whole again, well. And it says, now, if they don't believe the first sign, they'll believe the second sign. If they don't believe the second sign, now do this. Take some water out of the river Nile. Take it and pour it out on the dry ground, and it will become blood. And they'll believe that sign. And so the Lord has answered that objection pretty well, hasn't he? Moses still isn't through arguing with God. He says, now Lord, I am not eloquent. Why, I've never been eloquent. I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. You know what that people say is the number one fear? Public speaking. You imagine the number one fear that people have, other I suppose than death, is public speaking. And Moses was right in there with them. He says, "Why, I've just never been able to do that." And the Lord is getting a little angry with him now, it seems, in verse 11 of chapter 4. He says to him, "Who has made man's mouth? Or who makes the mute, the deaf, the seeing, or the blind? Have not I the Lord? Now therefore go, and I will be with your mouth, and teach you what you will say." The Lord's getting his anger up a little bit, it seems like. Moses is going to try one more time. He's going to say, "Please, just send whomever else you may send." And so in verse 14, the anger of the Lord was kindled against Moses, and he said, "Is not Aaron the Levite your brother? I know that he can speak well. And look, he is also coming out to meet you. When he sees you, he will be glad in his heart. Now you shall speak to him and put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and I will teach you what you shall do." And so that put an end to the arguments now that Moses can think of to make. And so now here he is ready. He's equipped with his 3 signs. God has appointed his brother to go with him and be a spokesperson for him. And so now he goes to his father-in-law, he goes to Jethro, and he says, asks respectfully, permission to go back and see his family in Egypt to see if they're still alive. And by the way, we're not told about that. We don't know if Amram and Jochebed, his parents, are still living or not. But in any event, he gets the permission of his father-in-law. He leaves with his family. And so now they're traveling to Egypt. And as they get back to Mount Sinai, sure enough, there's Aaron. And they are glad to see each other. And they go on to Egypt now together. They go to the children of Israel. They go to the elders. And they say to those elders that God has appeared to us. And he is going, through me, is going to deliver the children of Israel from Egypt. And so in verse 30, Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses, and he did the signs in the sight of the people. So the people believed when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel, and that he had looked on their affliction. Then they bowed their heads and worshiped. Do you see? It says the Lord has visited the children of Israel. Remember the end of Genesis in chapter 50? Joseph, as he is dying, says, "The Lord will surely visit you." And sure enough, that's exactly what the Lord is now doing. And so Moses and Aaron make their first little trial run, you might say, their first entry now into Pharaoh's presence. And they, in chapter 5, They say, thus says the Lord God of Israel, let my people go, that they may hold a feast to me in the wilderness. And Pharaoh said, who is the Lord, that I should obey his voice to let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go. So they said, we need to go 3 days' journey. And there we can sacrifice to the Lord our God, lest he fall upon us with pestilence and sword. And he says to them, basically, you need to go on and let the people get back to work. And Pharaoh decides that evidently the people have too much time on their hands, because they're saying they want to go out into the wilderness and worship this God that he knows nothing about. And so he decides, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take their idle time away from them. They had been, the Israelites were making brick. The Egyptians supplied the straw to make the brick. Now they take the straw away and say, you go find your own straw and make the same quota of bricks. And that was impossible to do. And so they complained to the officials with Pharaoh, and they explained to them why they've decided this. And now they go to Moses and say, you've just made us abhorrent in the sight of Pharaoh. Why, you haven't helped us. You haven't delivered us. In fact, it's worse now. But God has a plan, as he always does. And we come to chapter 6. We come to chapter 6. And verse 1, then the Lord said to Moses, now you shall see what I will do to Pharaoh. For with a strong hand he will let them go, and he will drive them out of his land. We go on down to verse 6 and say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burden of the Egyptians. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who brings you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. Remember the title of our study guide here. Remember, you shall be my people. And here we find in Exodus chapter 6, I will take you as my people, and I will be your God. You shall be my people. What a wonderful blessing now he is bestowing upon the children of Israel. Now, God says to Moses, go back again to Pharaoh. Now Moses, he still was reluctant because he's not well spoken. God says, Aaron will speak for you. Moses was 80 years old at this time. Aaron was 83. And so they come back now before Pharaoh. This time, Pharaoh asked Moses for a miracle. Now God has already said, now I'm going to harden Pharaoh's heart. He's not going to listen to you, but now you need to go through with this. And Pharaoh in chapter 7 verse 9, show a miracle for yourselves. It's what God says Pharaoh was going to ask. And so in verse 10, they go into Pharaoh, and sure enough, Aaron shows the miracles. He casts down his rod before all of them, and it becomes a serpent. Well, Pharaoh calls in his magicians, and they cast their rods down, and sure enough, they become serpents. And so in Exodus 7, verse 11, beginning, he calls his wise men, and they do the same thing, but Aaron's rod swallowed up their rods. But Pharaoh's heart grew hard, and he did not heed them as the Lord has said. Now, I'm not sure. Did the Egyptians' rods literally become serpents? Now, Aaron's did. But remember, the magicians of their day were very crafty, and they would fool people into thinking they were doing what they really were not doing. Or perhaps God allowed it to happen because God said Pharaoh's heart would be hardened. And sure enough, it was. He refuses to let God's people go. And God, as he had already said, now I'm going to work wonders, and Pharaoh will know who I am, that I am God. And so I encourage you, be back with us again next time. We're going to pick up and study the 10 plagues that God is going to send down upon the Egyptians. And one thing I want us to notice in doing this is that God is not only showing Pharaoh his power, but he is utterly humiliating the gods of Egypt. All of these plagues tie in to one or more of their false gods. And so God is showing his superiority over what they had falsely been worshiping. Join us next time as we continue to seek the old paths.
Give thanks to the Father